Good evening. I'm going to talk at you about Dunkirk a little bit. So, Christopher Nolan's one of the most renowned directors that's not from the era of Spielberg and Scorsese, that is an actual box office draw by name as a film director and an auteur. And he actually does some of the most creative things that directors are doing in the industry right now, regardless of his nitpicking, because there was a headline about him with Netflix recently. Basically, you have him most known for making the Dark Knight trilogy, revolutionizing indie films in the early 2000s with Memento and Insomnia, and then, did a wholly original concept, spent almost a decade interspersed writing it in Inception, with his brother Jonathan Nolan, and that just became an original surprise science fiction hit, and it was in the box office for about 12 weeks. Warner Brothers kind of wrote that one off as a fluke. Nolan's films are generally really solid movies, and I've always really enjoyed them. They're not without their faults. He's not a perfect director. People have talked endlessly about how he doesn't have great roles for women, or sometimes things come across a little contrived, or maybe sometimes a little too slick. But I always give him the absolute most props in any films that I ever watch for consistency and really great scripts and perfect systematic storytelling. When you go and see a movie and you understand the rules and the concepts of what a movie's supposed to do, you're not treated like an idiot when you're watching a Christopher Nolan movie. You kind of have those aha moments. You kind of put the pieces of a mystery together and you understand character structure. And I think that he does it better than everybody else. One thing that he is most known for in the last few years, kind of Dark Knight Rises onward, is being a stickler about the evolution of the film format in digital. People have been recording film in the digital camera world for what's going to be coming close on 2 decades now. And this is heavily featured in a documentary I had watched called Side by Side, about the conflict of old school cinematographers that would shoot on film cameras with film reels and film strips, the expensive classic Hollywood magic way, and now the digital authentic guerrilla style, the way that allows you to be more creative in how you tell the stories. So the reason that I'm talking about this is because Dunkirk is being shown in a myriad of formats. You could potentially have the possibility of seeing 5 different versions of Dunkirk in the way that it's projected. It's going to be shown in digital. It's going to be shown in 35mm film. It's going to be shown in 70mm film. It's going to be shown in digital IMAX and IMAX 70mm. So the distinction between all of those is so minute to the common moviegoer that there's a reason that digital has become the primary format of the industry, especially when you have smaller theaters that don't have the ability to afford renting out these expensive film reels and keeping upkeep on these expensive camera equipment. And then sometimes the equipment needs to be repaired or cleaned, and you don't have the staff or people being paid less than minimum wage to give a damn about the projector in the first place. The last time I saw a movie printed on film, if I can recall correctly, it was a local movie theater in about 2012. I took my aunt to see Cabin in the Woods, and the kid who was doing the projectionist job played the movie 20 minutes late, started with the wrong film, and then when he finally got the right reel and bitching and he tore it up and taped it together, the movie was being projected a quarter of the way up the wall. So I get it, nobody cares about Cabin in the Woods, but I was of the mindset in the last several years where I'd rather just be digital so it's crystal clean. Nobody has to watch it in the background. It's all automated. Nobody needs to switch the reels. The sound is all synced up. There's no reason to not do digital. I'm a huge proponent of that. I'm shooting on a digital camera right now, and I would argue that it looks a lot better, my camera, with the depth of field than a lot of broadcast media cameras. But Christopher Nolan is of the belief that there is a magic to use of celluloid film, and not only that, but large format. So when you talk about 35mm, that's like the kind that used to get printed. 70mm is the big version of that. If you picked up a Blu-ray of Interstellar when it came out on Blu-ray, you knew what that looked like because you got one in the box. You get like a little big film print of Matthew McConaughey, and when you have that amount of detail, you really do kind of get a sense of weight and a sense of color and grain and actual sound, believe it or not, as well, when it's presented in that format. And I learned that today when I went to go see a 70mm screening of Dunkirk on a standard size screen. And Nolan has always done this, even back with The Dark Knight. It was a big deal when he would film massive action scenes for a Batman film with massive, expensive IMAX cameras. So if you paid enough attention or saw The Dark Knight when it came out and you saw it in the IMAX format, you would actually see the difference between the letterbox projection and when it would exchange to massive scope wide shots where the picture filled the whole frame. And you even get that result when you watch it at home on a widescreen television. You get that intersplice, and it's a fun thing to see in terms of experiment and the use of different film formats within a single movie. So anyway, I don't want to go on too much about that, but basically, if you have the opportunity to see it in its intended format, in 70mm or 35mm even, try to see it in that format if you can, because you get so much color and life and actually, believe it or not, the motion of film, and even just kind of the old novelty of seeing the blips in the corner of the screen that every millennial learned about from Fight Club when the reels get changed over. It's the interesting little nuances about watching a movie projected in film that make it feel like that kind of classic cinematic experience. And it especially is important considering that Dunkirk is probably one of the most creatively directed films by Nolan in way of the camera work, but also in that it's made as an homage to classic Hollywood movies. So when I think that, I think of old war films. Like when you think about, what's an old war movie that you would watch? Like The Longest Day, Midway, Tora Tora Tora. What's another one? Old war movies.
Old war movies?
Yeah, like good ones.
Seven Samurai.
No, true. No, but okay, so the DP, director of photography on Dunkirk, was Hoyt van Hoytema. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. But he and Nolan have specifically gone on about influences from old pictures by the likes of Akira Kurosawa, in which you would reference movies like Kagemusha and, Yojimbo and Seven Samurai, and not necessarily in the warring aspect, because, old Japanese wars were very different, but in the use of color value and of movement. And you get that in spades throughout Dunkirk. And what I find interesting is that Nolan is a kind of director that not only challenges the industry in what is expected of movies, but he also challenges himself. The only kind of through line in terms of style that I've seen from Nolan is his modern take films. So his original film following, you can see the through line to Memento, and then through into Inception. You can kind of see that, but The Dark Knight, he's engrossed in that world of Gotham. In Interstellar, it's very much engrossed in the history of NASA and the far-off concepts of space travel. And I think that in Dunkirk, he tries very hard to grasp the authenticity, not only of these British troops in 1940, but of the state of decay that France was in at the time when under invasion with the Germans, as well as the structure and the pacing of classic World War II movies, as well as the history, I think. I don't know. So the basic premise of Dunkirk is that it's not truly a war film. It's actually, in fact, a complete tragedy. And you find that barely a minute into the movie. So basically the history of this siege upon Dunkirk was when the British and the French were essentially on their own defending France from early World War II Nazis. So in a darkest hour where the army forces of both Great Britain and France are attempting to escape a German-occupied Dunkirk, which is apparently how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. They are effectively abandoned. And the most tormenting part of it for these men and their commanding officers is that it's a stone's throw away. I think the number was like 400,000 people. 400,000. And these men in these armies spend a week waiting for somebody to help them. Meanwhile, they're being raided by Luftwaffe, which were the German plane units. Meanwhile, you have the British Navy. So you have this body of water, the English Channel, that sits between Britain and France, and Dunkirk's right there, and Britain is on the horizon line. And because of how frequently they're being raided by the Germans, like vermin, pretty much, there's no hope for them to be rescued. And so you have the iconic little boats in what was considered a miracle act. You would have civilian volunteers from Britain that would sail across the English Channel to basically discreetly pick up as many men and bring them back home as much as they possibly could. And you get that as your second focal perspective of the movie. And so Mark Rylance and the two boys come across a sinking vessel with a single man waiting on top of it, and he is in complete shell shock. And this man is played by Cillian Murphy, and he's a soldier that was attempting to escape from Dunkirk and was, caught in the middle of an accident, and it's the last place on earth he wants to ever see again in his life. And so you have the second perspective from this, I suppose, a naval perspective. And then the third and final aspect is Tom Hardy as a pilot named Farrier, and he's basically an ace dogfighter pilot in the British Air Force called the Spitfire. And you have really authentic, beautifully shot, really daringly composed dogfight sequences that I think are probably really unparalleled compared to others made in movies. It's the kind that George Lucas always wanted to emulate in his original Star Wars movies, except it's Nolan, so he literally took these IMAX cameras and put them on these planes, and it's visually breathtaking as well as auditorily, because the sound editing and the sound mixing on this are shoe-in Oscar wins for the year. And I don't know under what circumstances that any other movie would top what this has done. But based on these three perspectives of land, sea, and air, Army, Navy, Air Force, quote-unquote Navy, you have different proponents and different personalities and different perspectives on this tragedy. But more importantly, to the structure of this movie, you have different time frames. The Army men were on the beach attempting to hide, survive, or escape for a week. You had the Navy and the little boats crossing the English Channel within a day. And you had Tom Hardy and the Air Force crossing the English Channel within an hour's time. And the movie consistently intersplices and jogs in time between all of these to get a true immersive perspective on all of these. And it's a little jarring to watch at first, but once you start seeing the first overlap on what happens from this perspective and where the other comes into play, it just kind of clicks, and it reminds me of the moment where I was watching Memento and really got exactly what it was doing. And not only was I impressed by it, but like Nolan movies often do, makes me feel smart as a moviegoer. Other than that, there's really not a whole lot to the story or to the characters. It's funny to see a performer like Harry Styles get cast in this movie, and he's got a bunch of followers from One Direction, but he's just here actually acting really well, and he's got larger amounts of screen time than top billing actors with the likes of Tom Hardy and Cillian Murphy, or even Kenneth Branagh or James Darcy. You got a small amount of a who's who cast list, but the top two are definitely, in terms of screen time and screen presence, Harry Styles and Mark Rylance. And that's not to take away from everybody else's. This is truly an ensemble film because no single character is more important than the rest. This isn't a performance piece, it's an immersive experience of war. And it shows in not through excessive gore and violence. So when you think of a war movie and you think of it being terrifying and gritty and real, you think of Saving Private Ryan, you think of guts spilling out of people. Dunkirk does it in a way that's much more subtle. It does it with nuance, and it does it with off-screen scares, almost made like a Hitchcock movie. In fact, I don't think there's more than a single shot, I believe, that you see actual Nazis, actual Germans, actual adversaries outside of their artillery, like the Luftwaffe planes and, heavy artillery tanks, or just individual bullets. So it almost feels as though the sea, the English Channel itself, is just as much of an antagonist to these people, the Germans themselves. There's a couple of reasons why the French would think that this movie is anti-France, but that's not really the case here. I think that this movie is just trying to honestly and earnestly tell a tragic perspective of war that doesn't really feel like it gets touched upon all that much anymore. It reminds me of the tone of dread and hopelessness that you got from All Quiet on the Western Front, either the book version or the film version. And I mean that in the most positive way it could possibly sound. Because I think we need more things like it. We need war to not be glorified like that. So those are pretty much my thoughts, I think. And I do really want to, and I will go to my Twitter. I've already made my first reaction on Twitter after the film format screening, but I'm gonna definitely see it again this weekend just so I can directly compare digital to film at least. But I think if you're a fan of films, you got to see it. If you're a fan of classic war movies, like the old kind, definitely go see it. Like I say every time I see a Christopher Nolan movie, because I was kind of on Interstellar. Can't wait to see what he does next. I'll always look forward to a Christopher Nolan movie because I think I can anticipate that they won't ever feel samey to me.